The desert heat hit like a physical blow, 115 degrees in the Nevada sun, and Clark Gable stood in full Western costume waiting for Marilyn Monroe to emerge from her trailer. It was July 1960, day 37 of what should have been a 60-day shoot, and they were already 2 weeks behind schedule. Every delay, every missed day, every 4-hour wait for Marilyn to be ready, it all added up to more time in this brutal desert, more days away from his pregnant wife, more strain on his 59-year-old heart. Gable wiped the sweat from his forehead and checked his watch again. She'd been called to set 3 hours ago. He had no way of knowing that in less than 5 months he'd be dead. And Marilyn Monroe would spend the rest of her short life believing she'd killed him. The Misfits was supposed to be important. Arthur Miller had written the screenplay specifically for Marilyn as a gift. A serious dramatic role that would prove she was more than a blonde bombshell. Clark Gable signed on because he respected Miller's writing and because the role of Gay Langland, an aging cowboy, resonated with him. Montgomery Clift was cast as the damaged rodeo rider. Director John Huston would helm it. It should have been a prestige picture. Instead, it became a nightmare that destroyed everyone involved. The problem started before filming even began. Marilyn and Arthur's marriage was falling apart, disintegrating in real time as they tried to make this movie together. Arthur had written the script as a love letter to his wife, but during production, he was rewriting scenes to make Rosalind, Marilyn's character, more and more damaged, more pathetic, more of a burden to the men around her. It was as if he was channeling his disappointment with Marilyn into the screenplay, punishing her through her character. Marilyn knew it. She could read the new pages and see Arthur's contempt bleeding through every line. The film that was supposed to save their marriage was instead documenting its death, and then there was Marilyn's health. By 1960, she was deeply dependent on prescription drugs, barbiturates to sleep, amphetamines to wake, painkillers for her chronic endometriosis, tranquilizers to cope with anxiety. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, was trying to manage her addiction, but his methods were questionable at best. He'd prescribed Nembutal, Seconal, chloral hydrate, a pharmacy's worth of sedatives. Marilyn would take sleeping pills at night, then need stimulants in the morning to counteract them, then need more sedatives during the day to calm her nerves. The cycle was vicious and destructive. Some mornings, she literally could not wake up. Her assistant would find her unconscious, unresponsive, and have to physically drag her into a cold shower to revive her. Other days, she was so medicated she could barely speak, her words slurred, her movements uncoordinated. And every day that she couldn't function, the crew waited. And Clark Gable, in his heavy Western costume, stood in the 115-degree desert heat, aging a little more with each passing hour. But the most shocking part was still coming. Because despite everything, despite the heat, the delays, the disintegrating marriage, the pill dependency, when Marilyn was in front of the camera and functioning, she gave one of the most raw, vulnerable performances of her career. John Huston said Marilyn's work in The Misfits was extraordinary. The footage shows a woman completely exposed emotionally. It should have been her triumph. Instead, it became her torture. Clark Gable, watching Marilyn struggle, felt conflicted. As a professional, he was frustrated beyond measure. He was a man who showed up on time, knew his lines, did his job. Marilyn's behavior went against everything he believed about professionalism. But as a human being, he could see she was suffering. This wasn't diva behavior. This was a woman in crisis. Between takes, when Marilyn was lucid enough to talk, she'd apologize to him constantly. "I'm so sorry, Clark, I'm trying. I really am trying." And he'd smile kindly, pat her shoulder, tell her it was okay, that they'd get through it. "Don't worry about it, honey. We all have bad days." But his face told a different story. The exhaustion, the frustration, the concern that this production might never end. Privately, to the crew, to John Huston, to his wife Kay when he called home at night, he expressed frustration. "I don't know how much longer I can do this. The heat is killing me. My back is killing me. We're so far behind schedule. I just want to finish this picture and go home to my pregnant wife. I want to meet my son before I'm too old to throw a baseball with him." Montgomery Clift, himself barely functional due to his own pill and alcohol dependency, felt a strange kinship with Marilyn. They were both damaged, both struggling, both using substances to cope with pain they couldn't articulate. Between takes, they'd sit together in whatever shade they could find, not talking much, just existing in their shared misery. Clift understood what Gable didn't, that Marilyn wasn't being difficult on purpose. She was drowning, and the pills that were supposed to keep her afloat were actually pulling her under. But understanding didn't make the delays any easier to endure. It just made the whole situation more tragic. The production dragged on through July into August into September. What should have been a 2-month shoot stretched to 4 months. The Nevada desert in summer was brutal. Temperatures regularly topped 110 degrees. The crew was exhausted. Montgomery Clift was barely functional himself, fighting his own demons with alcohol and pills. Arthur Miller was rewriting pages every night, his marriage to Marilyn dying with each new draft. And John Huston was gambling away his salary in Reno casinos, drinking heavily to cope. This is exactly where everything changed. Because in early September they filmed the Mustang Roundup sequence, the emotional centerpiece of the film where the cowboys capture wild horses to sell for dog food. And Rosalind has a breakdown confronting the cruelty of it. It was physically demanding work. Real horses, real desert, real danger. The scene required the actors to chase horses across the desert in a truck, rope them, wrestle them to the ground. The studio wanted to use stunt doubles for the dangerous work, but Gable refused. He was Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood. He'd made his reputation partly on doing his own action work. At 59 years old, in 110-degree heat, after months of delays and stress, after decades of smoking that had already damaged his cardiovascular system, Clark Gable insisted on doing the dangerous horse work himself. The sequence took over a week to film. Gable was dragged behind a truck at high speed, rope burns on his hands, dust choking his lungs. He wrestled with panicked horses, their hooves coming dangerously close to his head. He did take after take in the blazing sun, his shirt soaked with sweat, his face red from exertion and heat. The crew watched nervously. John Huston, himself no stranger to pushing actors to their limits, actually pulled Gable aside. "Clark, please," used the stunt guy. "You've got nothing to prove here." But Gable waved him off. "I'm fine, John. Let's just get it done." And Marilyn, required for the scene where Rosalind has her emotional breakdown, kept missing her marks, forgetting her lines, needing the scene to be shot again and again. She'd arrive at the set hours late, barely conscious from the pills she'd taken to sleep. Then she'd need more pills to calm down enough to function. Her performance was raw and powerful when she got it right. Rosalind's breakdown felt genuinely real because Marilyn was having her own breakdown. But getting to those moments required hours of failed takes, of Marilyn standing in the sun unable to remember what she was supposed to say or do. What should have taken 2 days took a week. And every extra day was another day Clark Gable pushed his aging body beyond its limits. Kay Gable, watching from the sidelines, pregnant with their first child, pleaded with him to use a stunt double. "Let someone else do it, honey. You don't have to prove anything." But Gable refused. He was a professional. He'd finish what he started. Filming finally wrapped on November 4th, 1960. The cast and crew, exhausted and traumatized, scattered immediately. There was no wrap party. Everyone just wanted to escape. Clark Gable went home to Kay. Marilyn and Arthur Miller went their separate ways. Montgomery Clift returned to New York. John Huston went to edit, hoping to salvage something worthwhile. On November 6th, just 2 days after wrapping, Clark Gable suffered a heart attack. He was rushed to the hospital with severe coronary thrombosis. His heart had been damaged, likely from the physical strain combined with his age and stress. He stabilized initially, and there was hope he might recover. Kay stayed by his bedside, their unborn baby growing. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. And then, on November 16th, 11 days after finishing the Misfits, Clark Gable suffered a massive second heart attack and died that evening. He was 59 years old. He never met his son, John Clark Gable, who would be born 4 months later. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet, though, Because when the news of Gable's death broke, the Hollywood press immediately began speculating about the cause. And they didn't blame his age, or his years of heavy smoking, or the physically demanding stunts. They blamed Marilyn Monroe. The articles were vicious. Did Marilyn Monroe kill Clark Gable? The narrative was simple and cruel. Marilyn's unprofessional behavior, her chronic lateness, her inability to function had extended the production by months. She'd kept a 59-year-old man working in brutal desert heat far longer than necessary. She'd forced him to do dangerous physical work over and over because she couldn't get her scenes right. The stress and strain of dealing with her had literally killed the king of Hollywood. Marilyn, already fragile, completely fell apart. She was at a friend's house when she heard about Gable's heart attack. When he died, she collapsed. "I killed him," she kept saying. "I killed Clark Gable, it's my fault. All those delays, all those days in the heat. I killed him." Her friends tried to tell her it wasn't true, that Gable had been a heavy smoker for decades, that he was almost 60, but Marilyn couldn't hear it. She'd internalized the guilt completely. Gable, devastated and grieving, made it worse. In her grief, she lashed out publicly, suggesting the production stress had contributed to her husband's death. She didn't name Marilyn specifically, but everyone knew who'd caused the delays. The subtext was clear. If Marilyn had been professional, Clark Gable might still be alive. Wait a minute. Don't miss this detail, because the guilt Marilyn felt over Gable's death wasn't just about professional responsibility. It was deeply personal. Clark Gable had been Marilyn's childhood fantasy father. When she was Norma Jean, a lonely foster child bouncing between homes, her mother Gladys had told her that Clark Gable was her real father. It was a lie, a delusion born from Gladys's mental illness and her own brief time working in the film industry. Gladys had never actually met Gable, but in her deteriorating mental state, she'd convinced herself and told young Norma Jean that the handsome movie star was her daddy, that someday he'd find out about her and come rescue her from the foster homes. Young Norma Jean had believed it desperately. She'd saved her nickels to go see Gable's movies, sitting in the dark theater and imagining that this charismatic man on screen was her father, that he didn't know she existed, but would love her if he did. She'd cut his pictures out of magazines and hidden them under her mattress in whatever foster home she was living in. The fantasy had sustained her through some of the darkest periods of her childhood. Eventually, as she got older, she'd learned the truth. Gable wasn't her father, just another Hollywood star, and her real father was a man named Stanley Gifford who wanted nothing to do with her. But the emotional connection remained. Working with Clark Gable on the Misfits had been special to her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. And now he was dead, and she believed she'd killed him. The premiere of The Misfits in January 1961 became a funeral dirge. The film was dedicated to Clark Gable's memory. Marilyn didn't attend, she couldn't face it. Critics gave the movie mixed reviews. Some praised the performances, particularly Marilyn's raw vulnerability and Gable's weathered dignity. Others found it too bleak. The box office was disappointing. The Misfits lost money, all that suffering, and the film wasn't even a commercial success. Marilyn's guilt over Gable's death became one more weight crushing her. She was already dealing with her divorce from Arthur Miller, which would be finalized in January 1961. She was dealing with her failed relationships with the Kennedy brothers. She was dealing with her increasing dependence on pills and alcohol. And now she carried the belief that she'd killed Clark Gable. Friends reported that she talked about it constantly, obsessively. "I killed the king of Hollywood," she'd say when she was drunk or high, tears streaming down her face. "He's dead because of me. Gable is raising their son alone, because I couldn't get to set on time. That little boy will grow up without his father because Marilyn Monroe couldn't remember her lines." She started a ritual that friends found disturbing. Every night before bed, after taking her pills, she'd look at a photo from the Misfits set, her and Gable together, smiling during one of the good days. She'd apologize to the photo. "I'm sorry, Clark, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to, I tried. I really tried." Then she'd take more pills and pass out. The ritual became as much a part of her routine as brushing her teeth. It was compulsive, obsessive, a wound she couldn't stop picking at. Dr. Greenson, her psychiatrist, tried to help her process the guilt. He tried to explain that Gable had made his own choices. He'd chosen to smoke for 40 years. He'd chosen to do dangerous stunts. He'd chosen to push himself in the heat. But Marilyn couldn't accept that logic. In her mind, cause and effect were clear. Her behavior had extended the production. The extended production had stressed Gable's heart. The stress had killed him. She was responsible. She was guilty. She'd destroyed another person's life, just like she seemed to destroy everything she touched. You won't believe this, but the curse of the Misfits didn't end with Clark Gable's death. It seemed to follow everyone involved like a dark shadow. Montgomery Clift, already damaged from his 1956 car accident and years of substance abuse, continued his decline. The production had taken whatever was left of his stability. He'd die in 1966 at age 45, his body destroyed by years of alcoholism and pill addiction, found dead in his New York townhouse. Arthur Miller, though he'd live a long life into his 80s, would later say that the Misfits represented the lowest point of his career and his personal life, the public documentation of his marriage's failure, a screenplay that was supposed to be a love letter but became an autopsy. John Huston would call it one of his most difficult and painful films to make, a production that haunted him. "We were all damaged by that desert," he said years later. "It took something from all of us that we never got back." And Marilyn Monroe, carrying the guilt of Gable's death like a stone around her neck, would be dead herself within 20 months of his passing. When she died in August 1962, friends and psychologists who reviewed her case noted that her guilt over Gable had become pathological, one of the core beliefs driving her self-destructive behavior. She'd told her psychiatrist, Dr. Greenson, repeatedly, "I destroy everything I touch. Everyone who gets close to me suffers. Maybe the world would be better off without me." That belief, fed by the guilt over Gable's death, metastasized into suicidal ideation. The question that haunts this story is whether Marilyn's guilt was justified. The medical facts suggest not. Clark Gable had been a 3-pack-a-day smoker since his 20s. He'd had minor heart problems for years. At 59, doing dangerous stunts in extreme heat would have been risky regardless of schedule. His doctor later said the heart attack was probably inevitable. The years of smoking made it almost certain. The Misfits production might have accelerated it, but didn't create the condition. But Marilyn didn't think in medical terms. She thought in personal responsibility. She knew she'd been late. She knew she'd caused delays. She knew every extra desert day was more strain on 59-year-old Clark Gable. And when he died, she took that responsibility and turned it into crushing guilt. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Yes, Marilyn's behavior made the production longer and more difficult. Yes, that created strain on everyone, including Gable. But no, she didn't kill him. He was an aging man with decades of smoking damage, doing dangerous work in extreme heat. Many factors contributed to his death. Marilyn was one factor, but far from the only one. But telling her that didn't help. The guilt had taken root. Kay Gable in later years would soften her position. She'd say she'd spoken harshly in grief, that she didn't really blame Marilyn. But that reconciliation came too late. By the time Kay was ready to forgive, Marilyn Monroe was dead. The guilt had been one more factor in the spiral that ended on August 5, 1962. The irony is that The Misfits, despite all the suffering, is actually a good film. Watching it now, you can see everyone giving everything they have. Clark Gable's performance is dignified and moving. Marilyn's is raw and vulnerable in ways her earlier work never was. Montgomery Clift brings damaged authenticity. It's bleak and honest in ways Hollywood films rarely were in 1961. It deserved better than to be remembered as the cursed film, but that's how it's remembered. When people talk about The Misfits, they talk about the troubled production, the destroyed marriage, Clark Gable's death, the curse. The actual artistic achievement gets lost in tragedy, which is fitting, because that's what happened to everyone involved. Their talents got swallowed by the chaos. What you've seen is nothing compared to the psychological burden Marilyn carried in her final months. Clark Gable died in November 1960. Marilyn would die in August 1962. That's 20 months. 20 months of carrying the belief that she'd killed one of Hollywood's greatest legends. 20 months of "I killed Clark Gable" echoing in her head whenever she looked in the mirror, or couldn't sleep, or took more pills than she should. 20 months of that guilt combining with every other burden she carried: the failed marriages, the studio battles, the aging in an industry that worshipped youth, the Kennedy affairs gone wrong, the increasing realization that the pills were controlling her instead of helping her. In one of her last interviews, just weeks before her death, a reporter asked Marilyn about the Misfits. Her face changed immediately. "I can't talk about that film," she said quietly. "It cost too much suffering, too much loss." The reporter, sensing pain, didn't push. But what Marilyn meant was clear. The Misfits had cost her marriage to Arthur Miller. It had cost her health. It had cost Clark Gable his life, or so she believed. And it had cost her something intangible but essential, the last of her optimism, the last of her hope that things could get better, the last of her belief that she wasn't poison to everyone around her. The guilt over Gable's death was, in many ways, the beginning of the end for Marilyn Monroe. Before the Misfits, she'd been struggling but still fighting. After Gable's death, something fundamental broke inside her. She'd always had low self-esteem, always believed she wasn't good enough, always feared she was hurting the people around her. But Gable's death seemed to confirm her worst fears. She wasn't just difficult or troubled or struggling, she was actually dangerous. Her inability to function didn't just inconvenience people or cost money. It killed them. That belief, once established, was impossible to dislodge. Friends and colleagues from her final months all reported the same thing. Marilyn talked about Clark Gable constantly, about how he'd been kind to her on set even when she was making his life difficult, about how he'd waited patiently in the desert heat while she struggled in her trailer, about how he'd never gotten to meet his son because she'd kept the production going too long, about how Kay Gable had to raise John Clark Gable alone because Marilyn Monroe couldn't show up to work on time. It became an obsession, a wound she couldn't stop picking at, bleeding into every other aspect of her deteriorating mental health. The tragedy is that Clark Gable, by all accounts, didn't blame Marilyn. In his final conscious moments after the first heart attack, when doctors asked about the production, he talked about the physical demands of the stunts, the heat, his own decision to push himself. He didn't mention Marilyn's lateness or the extended schedule. And Kay Gable's initial angry comments came from grief, not from anything Clark had said to her. He'd been frustrated during production, yes, but he'd also been compassionate toward Marilyn, recognizing that she was struggling with demons he couldn't fully understand. But Marilyn never knew that. She never heard that Clark didn't blame her. She only heard the public narrative, that her unprofessional behavior had killed Hollywood's king, and she believed it completely. Because it fit with her existing belief system, because it confirmed what she'd always suspected about herself, because it gave her a clear cause and effect for something tragic, which was easier to bear than accepting the complex medical reality of an aging man's heart finally giving out. In the end, the Misfits destroyed everyone it touched. Clark Gable died. Montgomery Clift's decline accelerated. Arthur Miller's reputation suffered. John Huston added it to his list of painful experiences. And Marilyn Monroe took on a guilt so heavy it crushed whatever fragile hope she had left. The film that was supposed to prove Marilyn was a serious actress instead proved that she was broken in ways no one knew how to fix. The gift Arthur Miller had written for his wife became the public autopsy of their marriage. The comeback role became another failure, and the chance to work with Clark Gable, her childhood fantasy father, became another tragedy to mourn. 20 months after Gable's death, Marilyn Monroe would follow him. Different circumstances, different immediate causes, but connected nonetheless. Because the guilt over his death was one more weight on shoulders that couldn't carry any more weight. One more reason to believe she was poison. One more justification for the voice in her head that said the world would be better off without her. She didn't kill Clark Gable, but believing she did helped kill her. Which city are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think Marilyn was responsible for Clark Gable's death? Or was she an easy scapegoat? How would you handle that kind of guilt? Can we ever really be responsible for another person's health choices? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Boulevard of Monroe for more stories about Hollywood's hidden guilt, the burden of responsibility, and the psychological cost of tragedy. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story.